In this video, I will investigate several mysteries that I uncovered while researching my grandmother's family tree. When researching family history, one rarely comes across dramatic mysteries like an unsolved crime. Only modest, unassuming mysteries like where someone worked or what their maiden name was. The online records I found on Ancestry.ca helped me solve the initial mystery that prompted my research. However, that research only led to further mysteries, the last of which may actually have been a crime. While going through my grandmother's belongings, I came across two strange objects. The first object was this signet ring with the initials HH on it. The ring is 10-karat gold, the least amount of gold that a piece of jewelry can contain and still be called gold. It could have been a friendship ring or perhaps a mourning ring. The problem was, there was no one in the family that I knew of with these initials. The second mysterious object is this Masonic token. A Masonic token or coin like this represents initiation and membership into a Masonic lodge, in this case, Chapter 113 of Cornwall, Ontario. But again, as far as I knew, no one in the family was ever a Freemason, nor had anyone lived in Cornwall. So, two strange objects amongst what little remained of my grandmother's life. I suspected that they were merely curiosities picked up along the way with no personal significance, so I decided to try to sell the coin. But as I was photographing it, I noticed that initials had been carved into the coin's center. This was a common practice for Masonic initiates. The initials appeared to be JH or maybe JBH. Who was this JBH? Both the ring and the coin had H as a possible surname initial. Hoping to find someone with these initials connected to my grandmother, I took a second look at the Bates family tree. Here is what I discovered. My grandmother's name was Ethel Bates. She was born in 1895 and emigrated to Canada in 1913 at the age of 18. Ethel was the youngest in a family of 2 boys and 6 girls that lived in Staffordshire, England, in an industrial region known as the Potteries. The Potteries was a center of ceramic production since the early 17th century. By the early 1800s, production had become industrialized, and the ceramics industry was attracting labor from across England. At that time, the Enclosure Acts were expelling farmers from land that was traditionally used as common grazing land. Families that had lived off the land for generations were suddenly forced to look for work elsewhere. Something like this must have happened to the Bates family. The Bates lived and worked generation after generation in the parish of Drayton Parslow in Buckinghamshire, just south of Milton Keynes and Bletchley Park. There are Bates recorded in the parish records of Drayton Parslow as early as 1608, where they were smallhold farmers and agricultural laborers. I have not yet figured out exactly how Ethel Bates is related to these early Bates. I know from parish records that Ethel Bates' father is Alfred Bates, and that his father is Richard Barnes Bates, and I know they all descend from a guy named Newman Bates. But here's the problem. There are 6 different Newman Bates born in Drayton Parslow between 1726 and 1764. Why were there so many Newman Bates in Drayton Parslow? And which is my direct ancestor? Another mystery. Be that as it may, in the 1840s, Ethel Bates' grandfather left Drayton Parslow and moved his family 150 kilometers to the northwest to work in the Potteries. But life in the Potteries was not easy. The work was hot and dirty, the hours were long, and the glaze mix contained lead. Outdoors, the air was thick with smoke, and indoors, flint dust caused lung disease. Like her siblings, Ethel Bates would have been expected to find a job and a spouse in the pottery industry. Instead, she took the unconventional decision to emigrate. Before Ethel, only one of the Bates siblings left the Potteries, and that was her sister, Elizabeth Ann. Elizabeth Ann Bates was born in 1882, so she was 13 years older than Ethel. We can see on the 1901 census, Elizabeth Ann, aged 18, is working from home as a dressmaker. Ethel is 5. Their mother, Sarah Ann, dies 1 year later, so we can surmise that she is not in good health at this time, and that the mothering of Ethel is left to Elizabeth Ann. What about Ethel's father, Alfred Bates? We know from census records that he worked in the pottery industry for almost 5 decades, starting at the age of 16. Most of that time was spent at the Nelson Pottery, from which he retired around 1920. We get a surprising insight into Alfred's character from this newspaper clipping from 1918. The article describes how Alfred saves a 5-year-old boy from drowning in a canal, probably the canal behind Nelson Pottery that we can see in these photos. Incredibly, the article states that this was the 10th time that Alfred Bates had rescued someone from the canal. From this, we can infer that Alfred had a selfless character willing to help those in need. We might also infer, statistically speaking, either that Alfred spent a lot of his time hanging around canals, or that the people of England fall into canals with remarkable frequency. In 1908, when Ethel is 13, Elizabeth Ann marries a man by the name of Ernest Glover, and in 1910, the Glovers emigrate to Canada. The 1911 census shows that the couple are living in Ottawa and already have a son. Back in England, Ethel, aged 15, resides and works as a servant in the home of a hairdresser and his wife. Her father is now living with one of his daughters, so there is no longer a family home for Ethel. Without a home or an education, there are not a lot of options for Ethel beyond maybe finding a husband. Ethel chooses to emigrate. 3 years after leaving, the Glovers return to England to visit. When they leave again for Canada, they are accompanied by 18-year-old Ethel Bates. Ethel arrives in Canada on July 8, 1913, with $58 in her pocket. In 1918, Ethel Bates is living with the Glover family on Atlantis Avenue in Ottawa. Ethel does not appear on the 1921 census, so where she lives or what she does between 1921 and 1927 remains a mystery, although we can see from this landing card I found in her scrapbook that she visited England in 1922. These are my father's notes in which he reconstructs a timeline for his parents' lives. In 1927, Ethel lives in Toronto and marries my grandfather, George Frederick Clayton. The couple run a taxi stand from 1933 to 1937 at the southwest corner of Coxwell and Danforth, and then a fish and chip shop on the Danforth from 1938 until 1952. In 1952, with their only son living on his own, they sell the fish and chip shop and buy some roadside cabins north of Bracebridge on the old Highway 11. Unfortunately, in a classic case of caveat emptor, buyer beware, Fred and Ethel are not informed by the seller that there are plans to reroute Highway 11, bypassing Bracebridge and the cabins. Within a few years, Clayton's cabins are stranded on an unused stretch of road. Meanwhile, Ethel's sister Elizabeth Ann remains in Ottawa. Her husband Ernest dies in 1945, and in 1950 Elizabeth Ann also dies. She is buried in Ottawa, but her place of death is listed as Bracebridge, so she must have been visiting Ethel at the time. Fred Clayton dies in 1955. This photo in front of their home in Falkenberg, north of Bracebridge, was taken shortly before his death. Ethel remains at the isolated cabins until 1965, when she moves in with her son's family in Scarborough, where she dies. When the cabins are sold, the proceeds barely cover closing costs. Almost 60 years later, I go through what remains of Ethel Bates' belongings. There is a scrapbook that mostly contains articles about the royal family. There is a photo album with most of the photos removed, some ripped out. Of the photos that remain, most of the people are unidentified. There are vintage ceramics from Staffordshire, probably sent to her from family who remained in the Potteries. And then there are these two items, the ring and the Masonic coin. The mystery of the ring is solved when I take a closer look at a legal document that I find in Ethel's belongings, the final accounting for the estate of one Harriet Hackney, storekeeper, late of the city of Cornwall. The document, dated 1961, states that notice was sent to 20 people, most of whom seem to be Bates family members living in England. It is clear from the cover letter that no one attended the meeting. Research into English marriage records confirms that Harriet Hackney is, in fact, Harriet Bates, Ethel Bates' eldest sister. So, the signet ring bearing HH must have been a mourning ring purchased in her honor. It may be that the purchase of the ring was stipulated in Harriet's will, as this was a common practice at one time. But how had Harriet Bates ended up in Cornwall, Ontario as Harriet Hackney? And who was the Freemason, JBH? Harriet Bates was born in 1876. She was the eldest of Alfred Bates' 8 children and was almost 20 years older than Ethel Bates. On the 1901 England census, we see that Harriet is living in the Pottery district and married to a man named Joseph Hackney. We also see that another of the Bates sisters is living with them. And finally, we see that Harriet Hackney has a newborn son named Joseph B. This must be our future Freemason. We can follow up with the Hackney family on the 1911 census. By this time, Harriet's sister is married and moved out, and Harriet has 2 children, Joseph Baden, born 1901, and Arthur, born 1904. This census has a tragic note amended in the final column regarding Arthur. I'm not sure what the bottom 2 words say, but the top 2 words say infantile paralysis. This may indicate paralysis due to birth complications, but the term is often used to indicate the effects of polio. Either way, Arthur dies 2 years later in 1913 at the age of 9. On the 1921 census, still in the Potteries, Harriet's husband is out of work. Meanwhile, Joseph Baden Hackney is installing porcelain electrical insulators made in the Potteries on England's new electrical power grid. In 1922, Harriet's husband dies and Joseph Baden Hackney emigrates to Canada. This is 9 years after Ethel Bates emigrates. He seems to have a good job in 1921, so his reasons for emigrating can only be guessed at. According to the passenger manifest, Joseph Baden's plan is to work in Winnipeg harvesting, although there is no evidence that he made it further than Ottawa and Cornwall. 3 years later in 1925, Harriet Hackney, having lost her husband and 1 son, and at the age of 49, joins Joseph Baden, and by 1931 they are living together in Cornwall, where Harriet works as a housekeeper at the hospital. This is probably what is meant by storekeeper in her estate documents. On a visit back to England that year, Joseph Baden gives his occupation as silk worker. Upon his return to Canada, he gives his occupation as clerk, so I thought silk worker might be an error or even a joke. However, a Google search reveals that there was, in fact, a large silk factory located in Cornwall. It actually manufactured rayon, but this was commonly referred to as silk at one time. Joseph Baden Hackney dies in 1960, aged 60. Harriet Hackney dies 1 year later at the age of 85, predeceased by her husband and by both of her children. The only family that she has living in Canada is Ethel Bates. Perhaps Ethel traveled to Cornwall from Bracebridge for the funeral, but perhaps not. A short mention of Aunt Harriet that I found in my father's papers suggests that Harriet rarely visited her sister Ethel, and that Fred did not enjoy her company. So the mysteries of the ring and the Masonic coin, at least, are solved. However, 2 further Bates family mysteries emerged during my research. Look again at this list of the Bates children. This is compiled from census data, birth records, and other documents that can be found on Ancestry. Do you notice anything strange? We see Elizabeth Ann born 1882, but then, 5 years later, Alfred and Sarah Ann Bates have another daughter named Eliza Ann. Eliza is usually understood to be a shortened version of Elizabeth, so that is two daughters with effectively the same name, Elizabeth Ann. It may be that Alfred and Sarah Ann just liked the name. After all, three of their daughters share the middle name of Ann. However, I believe that Eliza Ann was adopted. I can find no adoption records, but there are other records that support this idea. Eliza Ann shows up in the England and Wales Christening Index with Alfred and Sarah Ann Bates listed as her parents. However, she does not show up in the birth index, even though all her siblings do. This suggests that while she was baptized as Eliza Ann Bates, no one was born with that name. Intriguingly, there is a birth record for an Eliza Ann Stokes, born in the same quarter, also in Stoke. After that, Eliza Ann Stokes disappears from the historical record. These anomalies are all explained if Eliza Ann Stokes has been adopted into the Bates family as Eliza Ann Bates. A quick pedantic side note. Unofficial or undocumented adoptions of this sort used to be fairly common. Because of undocumented adoptions and because of uncertain patrimonies, i.e., who the real father of a child might be, family history research should no longer be referred to as genealogy. We are not tracking genes nor genetic histories. We are discovering individuals and their family histories. This brings us to our final and perhaps more sinister mystery. In 1906, when this same Eliza Ann Bates is 19 years old and still unmarried, she has a daughter. The name given to this daughter is Minnie Hackney Bates. Hackney is an unlikely middle name for a girl, and I suspect Hackney is a reference to the father. But which Hackney could it be? Harriet's husband Joseph, who is 35 at this time? Perhaps his older brother? These are the likely suspects, but of course there may be a completely innocent explanation for an unwed 19-year-old mother naming her daughter Hackney. When researching family history, it is not uncommon to come across mysteries like this that hint at personal difficulties and even trauma, but which are now no more than bits of information in half-forgotten records. Who were Eliza Ann's parents? Who was the father of her first child? Did Harriet Hackney look back with satisfaction or regret upon a life that somehow brought her to Cornwall, Ontario? And how about Ethel Bates? While she was collecting articles about the royal family for her scrapbook, alone on a bypass property north of Bracebridge, did she ever regret her decision to emigrate? These are the sort of mysteries one inevitably finds researching family history.